I think that is everybody in. Right, let's begin. So hello, my name is Chris Case, and welcome to our presentation on context of the organisation. So I've been working for QMS for 3 years now, specialising in the implementation of ISO management systems and also working as an auditor, doing annual audits on ISO systems. If you have any questions that appear or come to your mind within the next, say, half an hour, 45 minutes this presentation will take, feel free to use the question section in the bottom corner and you'll be able to ask any questions and I will get to them all at the end. So let's begin. Okay, so we're going to go into the basics. We're going to look about what the context of the organization is. And the context of the organization is specifically clause 4 of most ISO management systems, especially the newer systems. So we're going to go into what else is within clause 4 and how it feeds into the rest of the management system, looking into a little bit into clause 5, a little bit into clause 6, because the flow of information flows from the context of the organization into leadership and into risk and opportunity. We'll be looking at internal issues as well as external issues. We'll be looking at two different really good tools that you can use, which are the SWOT and the PESTLE analysis. They're really great tools to help identify any external or internal issues that you may have. We're going to look into your scope of your organization, the management system and its processes, and then we'll get to the questions at the end. Right, so clause 4, the context of the organisation. So as an auditor over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been finding out that this has been a section of the standard that has been typically misunderstood because it was a new additional section of the standard which was introduced with the 2015 variant of specifically the 9001 standard and the 14001 standard. It forms part of the planning section of the standard, and the planning section of the standard is clause 4, clause 5, clause 6, and clause 7. So 4 is the foundation, so we'll start there. So the context of the organization in a nutshell is any internal or external issues which you feel you may have little or to no control over that could change, say, overnight, that could have an impact on what you do as a business. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative thing. It could be a positive. It all falls into your risk and opportunity. So later in the slide, I'll get into some really good examples of that and hopefully how they've impacted not only your professional lives, but some external contexts may have affected our personal lives as well. So we'll look into clause 4.1, which is identifying the issues, 4.2, which is the needs and expectations of your interested parties, clause 3, which is the scope, which is a brief sentence of what you do as an organization and what the management system is covering, and then clause 4 of the management system. So clause 4, being the context of the organization, does feed into further parts of the standard. So looking here, it ensures that it goes into clause 5.1.1, which is senior management need to ensure that objectives are compatible with the organization's strategic direction and the context. So when setting objectives, it's important to take into account any issues that you may have identified as part of your context. So looking at your internal and external issues could effectively feed further into your management system and set objectives. It'll make more sense later on when we get into what these external and internal contexts could be. It can impact your policies that you may have in place. Changes in policies, for example, the introduction of GDPR in 2018 with the Data Protection Act 2018 may have impacted some of your policies that you may have. Specifically, if you have a ISO 27001 system, it would have a heavy impact on that, changing data access policies and password policies and things like that. 6.1.1 is identifying any risk and opportunity. So when we talk about any internal or external issues that we may have identified in clause 4, you may want to address any risk that is associated with them. So that's how it feeds into clause 6. And then if there's any changes, so within your management review minutes, it's a requirement for you to review and identify if there's been any changes to your external or internal context. So it's also addressed there. Right. What is the context? What are the internal issues? So internal issues could be anything that could change inside your four walls that could have an impact on what you do. External issues can link to internal issues, but things like the things that are listed on the side there, so an aging workforce, changes in staff benefits, risks, assets, resources, knowledge and training, the business strategic direction, and employment practices. So any of these could change. Any of these could really have an impact on what you do. For example, an aging workforce maybe something that might impact you. Coming with age comes experience, but then also the risk of an aging workforce that not being able to complete tasks that they probably would have been able to do 20 or 30 years ago. The advancement of technologies may be harder for somebody that's been so used to the same practice for the last 20 years. There's plenty of internal issues that you could really look into, but anything that's related to your products and services, if there's any changes, any regulatory requirements internally, any additional assets. So we're talking about assets that could be automation has become a massive, massive thing within the last 20 or 30 years, replacing manpower. Resources and knowledge, online learning has become a lot more favourable. Hence why we're sat here now delivering a webinar, which if you would have asked me 2 years ago, I would have probably been sat in front of you in person. Any systems guidelines, any personal relationships, anything that could change internally that could potentially have an impact on what you do or service or product you deliver is an internal issue. How can you identify these? You can have external reports, internal meetings, feedback, communication from staff, internal audits as well could help with this. Your visions and values could change internally, could impact, obviously, and identify any internal issues you may have. Feedback from employees, the communication is a big one. It's a massive part of the standard, which I don't think is utilised as enough as it should be. But having the communication there, because your staff work, you're a part of a big team, and they're necessarily going to see things out of part of day to day that me personally, when I was a quality manager, wouldn't have seen sat in my office going through digits and facts and sheets while they're out there actually generating the data for me. Internal risks. If you have a risk register and internal risks, identifying any internal issues that you may have. Management review minutes are great for identifying any internal issues, and any process maps, tables, spreadsheets, any documentation that you may feel is required. So that's how you would identify any internal issues. But the biggest one for me is having the feedback for employees and having that level of communication. So external issues. So I would say in the last 3 or 4 years, the context of the organization and its external issues have probably been a lot more prominent to these management systems, and because there's probably been a lot more that has been covered within media, within your personal life, within your professional lives. And I know later on I'm going to breach upon the pandemic, but the pandemic would be a good example of an external issue. But there's really, really good tools in which you can use to address both internal and external issues. And one of my favorite is a pestle analysis. And with a pestle analysis, you would just basically sit down, look into the subheadings, which for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. And you would look at that subheading and discuss, has there been any changes to the political environment? Well, yes, we've left the European Union. How has that impacted? Everywhere that I've been driving in recent months, there's been signs all above the motorway saying that to check your papers traveling into Europe. trade may have changed. I know the fishermen have definitely been affected, but it's looking at political issues, then looking at economic issues, any social issues. I mean, social issues now in the pandemic is quite big. Any technological issues or technology issues. Yeah, it is pretty self-explanatory. Is there been any advancements of technology within your industry which could impact what you do? And it may be that automation is new, that certain vehicles are going to change. You might want to go down the route of having hybrid electric vehicles because you want it to reduce your carbon footprint because you're using a lot of diesel and a lot of mileage. That could be a technological aspect, external aspect, which you could look into. If there's any environmental issues that have arisen, I would say that environmental also feeds into the pandemic as well. And any legal issues, has there been any changes, any legislation? Has there been changes, anything, any of your compliance obligations or anything within the industry-specific legislation that may have changed in the last 12 months? Another example of changes of legislation, I would say that an external aspect or an external issue, as sensitive as the subject is, was the Grenfell fire, because it changed the fire regulations and it really focused in on fire regulations and fire controls. How can you identify them? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. Sitting down and having a review and discussing them identifies any external issues. You might have feedback from customers, you might have feedback from suppliers, any external reports that you may receive. If you have any external auditing, external memberships that you may have with certain sites, certain bodies, they may send updates. I know for QMS clients that are with Citation, they will receive updates from Citation, but there's plenty of other external bodies that you can use which will send updates of any external issues. There may be changes to industry requirement which will become knowledge. You might be externally audited by certain suppliers, and they'll be able to identify any external issues for you. And especially specifically if there's any changes, what I typically say with any external issues is once you've identified them and you review them annually, they very rarely tend to change until everything that's happened in the last couple of years. And I would say that change is more frequent now, looking into changes in legislation, changes in requirements. So it's definitely something that would need to be reviewed. And another tool that we can use to review this is a SWOT analysis. So just like the PESTEL analysis, the SWOT analysis is another great tool. And it goes into looking at what your strengths are as an organization, what your weaknesses are, what opportunities you've got, and what potential threats. And this is really, really good in the sense that it identifies any risk and opportunity, which is a large part of specifically the ISO 9001 standard, but it does fall into the 14, 45, 27001, and plenty of other standards, just to name a few. So looking at your strengths, looking at areas of your business which you feel you excel. Weaknesses, I mean, when we talk about weaknesses and we talk about areas for improvement, they're not necessarily negative things. The standards are all built on continual improvement. So it's identifying any areas of your business which you feel you may be able to improve. And that's not a bad thing. And then looking at threats, looking at any external issues, any competitors, whether your local neighboring business is now getting wagon deliveries 7 times a day, which is blocking your customers coming in and out. These are all different examples of any potential external issue which you could identify. Right. So this is the bit where now we're really going to talk specifically into some examples of external issues and hopefully how they've impacted you both professionally and personally. And I think maybe one of the 3 issues at least will have affected everyone here, making an assumption, whether it be good or bad. But these are examples of factors or issues that are affecting businesses today. Example 1 being Brexit. Up until February last year, whenever I described to any new organization obtaining any ISO standard, Brexit would be key. And Brexit would be something that I would bring up and talk about daily, saying this is changing, that is changing. I remember when I was out auditing a couple of years ago, when we was due to come to a deal, I think it was the March, which is the first time we were going to be looking at a deal. I know a couple of organizations that I went to bought 6, 7, 8 months worth of stock, not knowing what was going to change. Obviously, that was being delayed and delayed and delayed, but it's left a lot of organizations in a state of uncertainty of how it's going to impact their delivery or their service. Example 2 is Blue Planet. I know most people in the country enjoy listening to David Attenborough, and he on Blue Planet 2, he raised the issue of plastic pollution in the ocean, which has caused a whole movement since. I'll go to a little bit more detail that in a second. And then example 3, I don't think I need to talk about this one too much because I think everyone's probably heard enough of it, but the COVID-19 pandemic has affected businesses in ways that we would never have dreamt of, whether it's businesses that have benefited from it, whether it's organizations that have had to furlough 90% of the staff or all of the staff, businesses that have shut down. I mean, a lot of the major chains have really, really struggled with the pandemic because of the size of them and the amount of staff they've got working for them. But the one reason or another, I think everyone is probably being affected to some level by the pandemic. And that's an example of something that is out of your control, that literally came up pretty much overnight, unexpected. So yeah, there's another good example of an external context. Right. I've decided to talk about the Blue Planet effect, mainly because I was a quality manager and an environmental manager at the time that this episode of Blue Planet dropped, which is only 3 years ago now. And yeah, after it aired, there was a 15-minute segment, or even maybe 5 or 10-minute segment, where he highlighted that throughout the filming of the TV series, they encountered a lot of plastic pollution, and this really impacted the nation and created a reduction of single-use plastics. And you'll probably remember, if you think back, there was a lot of organizations that turned around and that released statements with their intent to release or reduce the amount of plastics they were going to use. So BBC banned single-use plastics by 2020. The British government announced that it was considering a national ban on single-use plastics, and then the Queen decided that she wasn't going to use plastics anymore. So yeah, the 5p carrier bags came in, which have now gone to 10p, 15, 20p carrier bags. There's deliveries now. Your food deliveries come without bags. The fact that there's now supermarkets that are now implementing bagless areas where you can put your fruit into any containers. Some have even introduced cereal you can put into your own containers. Yeah, so I mean, that's just a few examples of supermarkets releasing statements saying that they're planning to go plastic free. But with that statement comes a lot of work. So let's see how it really affects a business from an ISO standard. So I'm going to take one example. Off the back of Blue Planet, I know that McDonald's, Costa, and a few other chain fast food places turned around and stated they were going to reduce the amount of plastic waste, and one thing being was implementing paper straws, and that was one of the first things I think a lot of the public noticed, along with the changes within the supermarkets. I'm not somebody that indulges in McDonald's a lot, but I definitely noticed when they changed to the paper straws. So I just want to go down as something as a consumer of their products. It's understanding the level of controls that and implemented action that they put in place due to changing one little part of their business, which was straws. So it's looking into the environment of processes. So one thing that they introduced as well was implementing bins around site, which feeds into 7.1.3, which is control of your environment. It generated more of a focus on their environmental impact, which would feed into clause 6.1.2 and then environmental aspects and impacts. So looking at what impact plastic waste has on their organization and what they need to do to reduce that. And then it comes into the fact that just implementing something like a paper straw, doesn't really just happen overnight. That you've got to think behind the research and development, the marketing, the implementation of it. All feeds into section 8.3 of your ISO 9001 management system, which is design and development. Then sourcing new suppliers. If they're needing new suppliers for material, new suppliers for the actual product themselves, it's looking into supplier approval and looking into a new supplier of somebody that previously provided plastic straws to now providing a different product altogether. Trials and testing. I'm assuming that they didn't just get the first one and put it straight out. They may have trialed it, tested it, and gone through the processes of making sure that it was adequate for all of their products, which feeds into 8.3 and the monitoring and measuring as well, getting that customer satisfaction, customer feedback. And then there was complaints, unfortunately. There was complaints within McDonald's from staff and from users saying that they were inadequate, and that would feed into 8.7 and 10.2 of your management system right there. So even though that this external aspect, which would have been identified in clause 4, which would have been identified as what they called the blue planet effect, was the reduction on single-use plastics. We would then look into the risk and opportunity that would bring to the brand of, say, McDonald's, to be seen as using plastic products at a time when everyone was releasing statements to say that they weren't. And then looking at what action needed to be put in place to reduce that risk, which is all of the sections here. So you can see how one little thing has really impacted one management system. So that's the flow of information to identify the aspect, to associate the risk with it, and then to put plans in place and maybe even objectives. A lot of these organizations were releasing statements saying we are going to be XYZ plastic free by XYZ. And that's setting an objective for them internally, which feeds into section 6.2 of their management system. So does it affect you? Yep, the economic downturn could affect the ability of customers to pay your products, services. So yeah, that's now. I mean, I would say the pandemic has affected that quite a lot. Is not necessarily is it an issue internally? Are you furloughing staff? But is it affecting anyone within your interested parties? Is it affecting your suppliers, your staff? I know, for example, that British Gypsum had a real supply of plaster shortage. Back in the first lockdown, and that building supplies, even though that construction was allowed to go ahead, there was a problem with the supply chains. So that's one example. And then a cultural shift towards a healthier lifestyle, maybe one. Maybe if there's I know now diets and different diet options are becoming more prominent, and I know, for example, companies like HelloFresh and Gusto have now introduced additional boxes to cater to these changing lifestyles of their customers. So that's another example. Interested parties. So I know we've touched upon this a little bit, where I've said, how does it impact your interested parties? And what I meant by that is an interested party is essentially what we would refer to as a stakeholder. So anyone that holds a stake or an interest within your organization. The reason that we really look into this is because when we're identifying an external context or an internal context, any context at all, we're potentially going to be looking at who it's impacting within our management system. And when we're looking at the impact of our management system, we need to be looking at who has an interest in our business and who is going to be affected by this external context. So we always recommend reviewing your interested parties and what their needs and expectations are. And if you communicate with them, who's responsible for the communication and how frequent. So yeah, so that really feeds into the context of the organization as well. Then we determine your scope. So 4.3, determining the scope of your organization. And the easiest way to describe this is to say it is a brief sentence that would describe what you do as an organization. And this will be documented upon your ISO certificate, potentially a scope document if you have a scope document. And this is to really identify, when addressing an external context or internal context, what part of the organization it would affect. For example, if there is a change in plastic, a reduction in plastic waste externally due to the Blue Planet effect, and you're a manufacturer of cotton, the chances are it's probably not going to affect you, but maybe the environmental awareness may. So it's looking into what you do as an organization. Is this external factor going to affect you? Do you need to put any further plans in place based on that? And then clause 4 ends with 4.4, which is management system and your processes. So you can probably read there the references to what we mean within management system and its processes. So as an external auditor, when I would come in and look at your management system and its processes, I would expect to see some form of management system in place. It doesn't necessarily have to be a documented manual or a documented process, even though they are very, very common nowadays. We expect to see some form of management system in place that is implementing certain controls to ensure that your management system is being managed on a day-to-day basis. And it's looking into whether you have a system which is being updated, whether a system that is being utilized. As an external auditor coming in, I would look at whether you have processes in place, whether you have a manual in place, whether you have documentation in place, and whether that documentation is being used or utilized. Things like standard operating procedures, work instructions, anything like that is the sort of thing that we would expect to see in place to assist with the implementation of any ISO standard. Whether you have process diagrams, whether you have any sort of resource diagrams or outsourced processes is another thing. It seems to be quite typical with ISO 45001 that there would be some health and safety representative. With 9001, we would say that there may be outsourced sections of the standard as well. It's entirely up to you what your management system and processes are, as long as when we come at an external audit or when you are being externally audited, that it is evidenceable that you have some form of management system in place. Okay. And that is pretty much it for the Context of the Organization webinar. So we do have some further links here. So if you need any more information on the requirements of ISO 9001, that's at the top there. Just to let you know, ISO 9001 is pretty much the foundation of all standards. So context of the organization is evident in pretty much every standard at the moment. It changed, like I said, in 2015, and it's become a new requirement, and it's going to stay. It will be there for future standards. The evolvement of the standards has tended to go down the risk and opportunity route. And you can read, there's an article there a little bit more on clause 4, which is created by a wonderful marketing team. And then if you do have QMS Connect, you can log in there. So QMS Connect is one of our online systems which you can use, and it assists with the implementation of ISO standards. So if you do have any more information or want any more information on that, you can click on the link there and you can speak to one of our representatives. Okay. Are there any questions? Let me just open this up. Yes, definitely. So yes, sorry, I'm just reading. Would you say a suggestion box feature definitely comes within our remit to gain employee feedback? Yes. Conversation can be employee feedback. There's no specific requirement within the standard to say this needs to be a documented requirement. But when it comes to employee feedback, clause 7, 7.2 and 7.3 and 7.4 of the standard is your competence, awareness and communication. As part of that section of the standard, it will require you to review competence and awareness. Something typical of that is having like an annual training review or an annual review, and that tends to be a good point of feedback. Even just having any employee updates or simply having your door open for somebody to come and walk in and give you feedback is a great way. So having a suggestion box is perfectly fine. I can tell you if an employee's got a problem with something, they'll be the first ones to let you know. But yeah, that's fine. Yes. So this is talking about integrated management systems. Yes. So the whole point of Annex SL, the Annex SL structure, is to line multiple standards together so that you can audit or review certain sections of your standard, but also use the same templates, documents, and processes. So, for example, if you was going to address clause 4 of your management system, and for example, you were to use a SWOT analysis or a pest analysis, just an example, as long as you have documented in there or referenced each individual standard, there might not be any for the 14,000 or the 45,000, for example, and there might be predominantly 9,001 this year. But as long as you can see, we can see that you've done a review, and this also comes into your management review as well. You can document them within your management review. So yes, I would say now that the pandemic would address all 3 standards. So I would say if you were to reference the pandemic within your internal audit of clause 4, I would say then yes, it would cover all 3. But yeah, there's no need for duplication. The introduction of Annex SL was to make things more streamlined and more integrated. So yeah, having an integrated management system, yes, you need to do it once. That's it. You have to do it 3 times. Okay. No, you don't. So ISO, the actual copy of the standard, you can actually purchase straight through ISO themselves. I had to pay for my own copy. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. There is a lot of reference information online for free if you just simply Google them, and there's plenty of instructions. And within QMS side of things, we have plenty of articles on our website which will go into multiple sections of the standard. But as far as an actual copy of the standard, no, you do have to buy them directly from ISO themselves. Because QMS don't have our own version of ISO 9001. We are simply auditing you and consulting you to their standard. I don't know how much they are specifically. They were about £120 when I bought one a few years ago, but you'd have to go and look into that. But if you go onto the ISO website, I'll post the ISO website within the chat at the end, so you can go on there and have a look yourself. So no and yes. So when it comes down to documenting whether you have assessed it, you don't necessarily have to document the specific items. I mean, I know I talked about a pestle analysis and a SWOT analysis. We document it. You don't necessarily have to document the actual content, but yes, you do have to document that you have reviewed it, and that would come as part of your management review. In your management review, it wants you, one of the specific agendas that you would have to follow, or one of the agenda items, is to review any changes to any internal or external contexts. So yes, so it would be documented as part of your management review. When it comes to reviewing your context, and just to touch on this a little bit more, to have the documentation and, for example, a SWOT and a pest analysis, and to create them from the get-go is probably a lot more work, in the sense that you have to sit down and create a document. But going forward, it becomes easier to manage and maintain, because when you would come to your management review, you would purely check that document and make sure it's still up to date and relevant. And within your management review, you would say a SWOT or a pest analysis is in place, it is being reviewed and still being deemed adequate and up to date. And then I would change the date on your SWOT or pest analysis to say this being reviewed. You can just document them as part of your management review if you want to go down that route. But like I've been saying about risk and opportunity, the risk of that is if you then, for example, miss your management review, the chances are you won't have reviewed your context for that year, which means you would probably fail in multiple areas of your management. Plus, if I was to think back 2 years ago, or even last year, what all the relevant external contexts were, my memory is not fantastic. So having it written down, I would say, is beneficial. But yes, you do have to document them within your management review at a minimum. So we don't specifically expect to see a SWOT or a pest, but yes, it is a part of 27001. 27001 still goes into the context of the organization. With the 27001, though, you're going to have more controls, and probably controls that are relating to any external context within your statement of applicability. But I've actually been carrying out an appointment this morning talking about this very subject, and I would always still recommend having your business review separate to your statement of applicability, and having a review of your external context, your objectives, your risks, as a separate entity. Just like when you would audit your ISO 27001, you would look at your front end management system, your statement of applicability, and then your policies. So I would say, yes, there still needs to be the requirement to review and document your review of your external context, even though it is part of an ISO 27001 system, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a SWOT or a PESTEL analysis. Your review is entirely up to you. I hope that answers that for you. Yes. So it can be described and defined in your scope. I mean, I'm not fully certain what you mean by this. What I would say is, if you have, for example, if you're addressing your context, your organization within a separate document within, say, I wouldn't say it would be addressed within your scope document. Your scope document might state what your weird finding here, what your management system is there to manage. So, for example, the statement, a brief statement of what you do as an organization. I wouldn't say that the context of the organization would be described within that. What I would say is, if there is an external context or an internal issue, check your scope to make sure that it doesn't impact what you do, if that makes sense. I'm hoping that's what you meant by that. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question, so I do apologize if I've not answered that correctly. Possibly. I'm not the person to ask. The marketing team are probably sat in the list on the side. Yes, I assume that there is going to be. There's nothing in the pipeline yet, but I definitely know that they're going to be considering it, and I would be happy to deliver if we do go down that route. My background is predominantly environmental, but there's nothing planned in yet. But if you just keeping with the updates from QMS and keep checking our website, yes, it should. There should be hopefully something coming in soon. So I apologise, but not yet. Yes, yes, you'll be sent a link, and you can download it afterwards. The whole slide, the presentation, everything will be accessible. I will post a link in at the end. I have it somewhere. If you give me 1 second. Yep. And also, if you have any further questions, if I just put it into the public window. So this is just, yeah, I'll pop it in a second at the end of the slideshow. Is that it? Any more questions? I think that may be it for the questions. I'm just going to double check, make sure I've not missed anybody. Right, brilliant. That's it. Fantastic. So I would like to thank everyone for coming. It's been a pleasure. I hope that I've at least answered some questions, and that your knowledge around this area may have been broadened a little bit. It is a difficult part of the standard to pretty much grasp, especially if you've come from an older standard to a new standard. It's just about identifying these external issues and making sure that I mean, not everyone has a crystal ball. We can't foresee the future, but we can at least predict and predict that if there's a change in an external issue or an internal issue, that we might be able to. So I'm just going to post a little note on the end. You should be able to download the slideshow. You'll probably get a link, or there will be an email for you to request it. If you do have any further questions, there is you can address it at marketing@qms.com. And if specifically, if you've got a question of me, you can at ccase@qmsuk.com. You can come directly to me. And yep, thank you very much for tuning in. There is the link there. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you on the next webinar. All right, thank you. Cheers. Bye bye.